Hello folks, welcome back to our recorded lectures for ML103. This is Scorn-poles and Seidr, magical traditions from early medieval Europe. Alright, it's tricky to evaluate the role of magic in Scandinavian society. They didn't spend huge amounts of time classifying or defining their ideas of magic. To them, sorcery was a means or a set of mechanisms to compel non-human forces to do their bidding. This is something that happened within the community, not within a religious context. The vast majority of our evidence from the magical tradition comes from sagas and poems, and there's a lot of it. It's not talked about in anywhere near the same way that witchcraft from elsewhere in Europe is talked about at the same time by southern writers. So to give you an example, the Volsunga saga talks about how, quote, the airs and the pass were alive with magic. That's not at all like how magic is typified in southern Europe. There are many different kinds of magic in the Scandinavian context, as far as we can tell. Some are well defined, some are vague. There are many different types of practitioners. So you can't make any generalizations because they actually obscure the diversity of practices. So I'll give you an example. Galder was a type of magic. It was a high-pitched singing. And it actually, we think, survives in a non-magical form, obviously, in cattle calls that are still part of Nordic folk music. Now, in contrast, gander was a type of magic used by men. We don't know much more about it than that. There were other types that could be used on their own or in combination. Some had specialist practitioners, some did not. And there is one that is worth considering on its own. And that, of course, is Seidr, which you might call the most dangerous form of magic. Now, according to Norse mythology, Odin learned Seidr from Freya. This was women's magic. It was Vanir magic. It was not something he should have learned, but as we know, he was hungry for knowledge, and that was not always a good thing. Seidr could do a lot of different things. It could foretell the future, whether that was the fate of an individual or the fate of a whole region. It could improve the harvest. It could heal or harm. It could bring good fortune or bad fortune. You could use it to talk to the dead, to seduce or charm a person, confuse or terrify them, weaken them or strengthen them. There's a reason that it's associated with the gods of war, sex, and intellect. These are the areas where it was supposedly most effective. Now, Neil Price, who writes about Old Norse religion, argues that the Norse borrowed a lot of traits of Seidr from the Sami people, who are a group of reindeer herders who migrated into northern Scandinavia around the same time that the Scandinavians migrated into the southern regions. Now, they were reindeer herders, as I said, and they were somewhat isolated from the Scandinavian population, but not entirely. There were areas that they would have mingled and intermarried, and so quite obviously could have passed on cultural traits that way. Now, some scholars see the staffs that were used by practitioners of Seidr as distaffs, staffs made for spinning wool, and the idea is that Seidr itself is spun. When you spin Seidr, you're creating a sort of magical emissary to accomplish whatever it is you wanted to do. And if you translate the word Seidr, it is something approaching string, cord, snare, or halter, so it's suggestive. And there are also connections, if you read it that way, to the Nornir. Now, Seidr could be performed as a ceremony, part of a ritual, to accomplish a specific goal, so to gain knowledge from outside the regular order of events. In sagas where there is a strong Christian element, this is often disapproved of implicitly by the author, or at least you get the strong sense that it is. The idea that a feminine form of magic is a destructive force cannot be solely ascribed to the Christian period, however, because it underlies even some of the oldest of our sources, like the Völuspa. Now, men who practice Seidr are often called ergi, which is translated sometimes as unmanly, sometimes as homosexual. Practicing Seidr was supposedly shameful for men. Even Odin came in for some criticism on the subject. We'll touch on that when we look at the Lokasina and Loki insulting him for it. But what's interesting is that the word ergi could also be used, if less frequently, about women. This is usually in cases where their sexuality is unrestrained. So really, is it perhaps a more general word that refers to a failure to follow gender norms? One scholar suggests that the use of Seidr was such a negative thing for men because it was used in a way that suggested you were being penetrated by spirits. So hence, if you practice Seidr, you are feminized to a degree. Also because its practitioners identified so heavily with Freya. Now, in general, it most commonly shows up in the sagas as a divination ritual, but there are certainly other ways that we see it. And again, in most cases, it's not individual destinies it's meant to determine, but whole areas. All right, so let's look at an example from our case study games. So Freya in God of War is actually a really interesting representation of sort of a divine Norse sorceress. One of the very first things you see her do is heal the magical boar that Atreus wounds. And I don't know if anybody knew this, but there's a suggestion, a theory, that the boar is actually her twin brother, Freyr. Now, she is also able to put a mark on Kratos and Atreus to hide them from the Aesir. She resurrects Mimir's severed head at Kratos and Atreus' request. She's also very upset when he proceeds to out her to Kratos and Atreus. Most importantly, however, she helps Kratos heal Atreus after he falls ill, which he does because of his internal conflict between his divine nature and his belief that he's simply mortal. Obviously, her most remarkable example of magic is being able to make her son, Baldur, basically invincible. And that is certainly an example of strengthening him, as much as he didn't want it, and it wound up damaging him. There doesn't seem to be any specific limits to Freya's power, apart from the limits put on her by Odin's curse. So, for example, she can't leave Midgard. She tries to go to Alfheim with Kratos and Atreus and cannot. Now, in the final confrontation of the game, she actually reanimates a dead frost giant to try and separate Kratos and Atreus from Baldur. She demonstrates other abilities. She commands animals. So, for instance, the giant turtle that lives underneath her home, or on her home, really. She has control over plants. She shifts her shape. She has other talents. The breadth of what she's able to do with Seidr, even under Odin's curse, is an excellent reflection of the fact that Seidr can do effectively whatever you want it to do, according to Norse belief. When you throw in the fact that she's also the former queen of the Valkyries, I think Kratos is going to have his hands full in the second game when we finally get to see it this coming year. The way she threatens him at the end is deadly serious. For those of you who haven't played it, she basically says, I will rain down every agony, every violation imaginable upon you, and feed your soul to the vilest filth in hell. And, she is quite capable of doing that. Now, I'm going to move on to another example of Norse magic, and I want to talk about the völva. So in sagas, the magical practitioners of Seidr, and sometimes of other types of sorcery, are those who carry staffs, völva, or sorceresses. Certainly there are graves that have been found with staffs and female skeletons in them, or at least they appear to be female skeletons. They're gendered as women by scholars based on that association, but are we sure? There's still sometimes doubt as to which sex a skeleton actually is. Even when they're dressed in women's clothes, does that give us a definitive answer? It could be men who are dressing in women's clothes. It could be trans women. It could be people who see themselves in a completely different gendered way than we actually can grasp. We don't know. Now, these graves with staffs in them, however, do also have other tools of the trade. Things like hallucinogens, animal body parts, charms and amulets, that sort of thing. Very often the völva are described as shamans by scholars, but it's risky to label practices as shamanic, even if it does touch on the soul traveling to other places or in other forms. It's a way to kind of imply that it's more primitive than organized religion, and that's not really a good way to look at it. There is a very unusual grave found at Burka, dating from the mid-10th century, where it appears to be the grave of a woman, but with objects that suggest she may have been a sorceress, including an iron staff. but she's also buried wearing a pendant crucifix around her neck. Of course, what's interesting is that it's strung on a necklace of beads along with some amulets that are decidedly non-Christian. So what does this mean? Well, it could mean that she kind of liked the idea of Christianity and, plucked out a few things that she enjoyed and is trying to harness whatever Christian magic she perceived there to be as part of practicing her art. Now, there are numerous narratives in literature where a völva helps protect or guide a hero, and what's interesting is that it's usually against an unjust patriarch. It's a repeating motif. She will actually provide spells or physical assistance or help them find the information they need via magic. Now, conversely, it's also a völva who gives Odin the information he needs on a number of occasions about Ragnarok, about Balder, etc. So in those cases, the völva are actually helping out the unjust patriarch. But to be fair to them, it is Odin. He likes to ask völvas questions while they're in their graves, so do they really have a choice to answer him? Not so much. The völva is also described often as somehow related to giants, sometimes raised by them, whenever she's encountered by the gods. This is implying a connection to the Aesir's enemy, which is one of the reasons why the gods are supposed to be careful in consulting them. Now, you might wonder about that image on this slide. There was a photo shoot done a little while back where somebody tried to reconstruct the costumes worn by women in the graves that are identified as potential sorceresses. And they're out there on the internet. They're quite fascinating photos and interpretations. And this was just the one I was able to find. Okay, so the example I want to use of a völva from our case study games is from Assassin's Creed Valhalla. And I want to talk about Valka. So she appears early in the game to provide counsel to Eivor after Eivor has a strange vision. She feeds them a hallucinogen, which brings on another even stranger vision, where Eivor sees the Nornir, Fenris, her brother Sigurd without an arm, and what we eventually discover is Odin. Now, Valka will tell Eivor afterwards that Eivor's destiny is a great one, that they have their place in Valhalla guaranteed for them, but that they will also betray their brother. And this haunts Eivor for the rest of the game. It frames the choices they have to make regarding Sigurd's actions. And eventually, depending on the choices that you make, it will shape the ending of that part of the story. Now, Valka is not particularly comforting, and she doesn't seem to be bothered by that. She tells the truth, not what those who come to her want to hear. She initially stays behind in Norway because her mother Svala is ill. She has a connection to the Isu through Svala, who, as we've mentioned, is a reincarnation of Freya. So she is Freya's daughter, basically. She does eventually join the rest of the clan in England after her mother vanishes into the wilderness, presumably to die. And there she helps Eivor continue to explore their visions. More drugs and sending them off to explore Asgard and Jotunheim. Now, what's interesting is that while she was living in Norway, she actually lived on top of a nearby mountain, quite some distance from the settlement, and it took quite a trek for Eivor to see her the first time. But in Ravensthorpe in England, she simply lives in a hut on the fringes of the settlement, not so far away from everyone else. She's at a bit of a distance, but nothing like she was in Norway. So I'm not sure if that was meant to suggest she's more integrated into the settlement when she moves to England, or whether that was just an oversight. She is placed beside one of the area's finest natural features, this beautiful waterfall. Now, I would say the most interesting of her appearances in the game is right towards the end, at the beginning of the last main story arc. So Eivor is heading off to join Guthrum to move against King Alfred for the last time. And Valka intercepts them and is basically panicking, and this is the dialogue that ensues. Valka says, "Eivor, you must not go, you must not. The signs, the portents, they shout and wail. Your leaving will be our doom." And Eivor says, "Speak clearly, Valka, what have you seen?" Valka's response is, "I have thrown the bones, I have stirred the offals of beasts, and in the rising steam I see the end of all. Though this battle you may win, this war you will not. Your foe will be your master, your hope will be your grief. This is fate, our fate." And Eivor says, "I thank you for this, Valka, but the yarns of fate are too frayed for me to follow now. I owe this fight to my friends and allies, and I will see it through." Valka sort of gives up and says, "Go then, with great care. but know that the home you leave will not be the home to which you return. So we're never 100% sure what that means. Is it the trap that Alfred sets that she sees, the death of Ivor's friends, or is she referring to the fact that Alfred will eventually reveal himself to have used Ivor to wipe out the Order of Ancients? Hopefully we get an answer at some point. It would make almost more sense if she'd seen this before the confrontation with Basim, but this is hard to say. It's a loose end. It's a prophecy of doom, basically. All right, so the last example I want to use of magical traditions is the Scorn-pole. And please don't look horrified at that image. That is a modern Icelandic Scorn-pole using a fish instead of a horse's head. It's just one I found, and it was sufficiently awful looking, so I decided to use it. So Egil's saga shows us probably our best known example of a Scorn-pole. Egil is in the midst of a conflict with Eric Bloodaxe and his queen, and he raises a Scorn-pole against them. This is a hazel pole with carved runes. It's called a nidstong, and a horse's head on top of it. So he raises the pole, he makes an invocation where he turns the scorn upon the king and queen, but also upon the land spirits, and he sends the land spirits away. Says, drive Eric and Gunhild from the land. The act of speaking the invocation is the important part. The pole is basically a token. Now, by driving away the land spirits, the place is left without protection and it cannot be at peace. In a later version of the saga, it actually makes the horse's head into the head of the king's son, which is even worse. Now, there are other examples of Scorn-poles. In another saga, someone fails to show up for a duel, and the man who challenged him carves a human head, puts it on a post carved with runes, then kills a mare and buries the post into the mare's chest and points it towards the coward's house. There are several other sagas that deal with wooden poles that defame the target, although sometimes without verse or runes. Possibly this is a combination of two different types of nithir or scorn, verbal scorn and wooden scorn. The poles are something that are still practiced by modern pagans from time to time, as well as Icelanders of a more traditional bent, including one man whose neighbor ran over his puppy, so he put up a Scorn-pole. There has been the occasional pole raised to make a political point about someone's misbehavior. In one case, it was a protest against a hydroelectric project. It's sometimes also been raised as a way of challenging those who misappropriate Icelandic culture for white supremacist goals. So where do we see it in the games? So in God of War, we do have the Scorn-poles themselves, and they function as a game mechanic, just as they do in Valhalla. The Scorn-poles in God of War emit poison and block the way forward. They can be frozen with the frost axe, or otherwise manipulated with magic. Freya at one point wraps a bunch of them in vines to allow Atreus and Kratos access to one area. Kratos actually tells Atreus about the Scorn-poles early in their journey and tells him that Faye was the one who taught him how to disable them. Now, their role in the puzzles obviously becomes more complex as the game progresses. They're just a part of the puzzles that you have to solve. You'll have the Scorn-poles, you'll have the gears, you'll have blocked areas, that sort of thing. Now, in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, what you have are cursed symbols in areas that are under some sort of malign magical influence. And they're represented in very interesting ways. Ivar will be riding by, their vision will start to go dark, he'll appear buzzing like flies, and realize that some sort of dangerous magic is at work. The nature of the cursed areas differs from place to place. There's always a central curse symbol that you have to destroy to end the effect, but sometimes you'll see sacrificed animals. Sometimes you'll see dead human bodies, often laid out in a very ritualistic way. The symbols are sometimes hidden in trees or in caves or behind doors or debris. You will sometimes find notes and the like talking about the curse involved. It's interesting because you are finding them in England, not in Norway. And that speaks to a shared tradition of northern magic. If you destroy them, you get a skill point, basically. So they're just, again, just a mechanic, not anything you have to do, but it's really kind of jarring to ride into the cursed areas. It's a very dramatic effect, especially on the newer console. So I hope you can see how Norse traditions of magic are woven into at least two of our case study games in some depth, both narratively and mechanically. The Scorn-pole in particular, I suspect, was too cool not to use. But Seidr itself is also very flexible. It can be whatever you need it to be within the context of the game, which is definitely useful. Okay, so we will be back with another lecture soon.